This is a quiet story, told slowly. There's nothing you need to do, and nothing you need to remember. You can listen closely, or let the words fade into the background as you rest. The story will move gently, without sudden moments, and it will stay with you whether you're awake or drifting off. Tonight's story is The Man Who Walked at the Dog's Pace. The street was quieter than it had been an hour earlier. Most of the lights in the houses had softened or gone out entirely, leaving only a few windows glowing faintly behind curtains. The air carried the smell of cooling pavement and damp leaves, the kind of scent that lingered after a mild day without ever becoming sharp. Peter stood on the step outside his front door, fastening the lead with patient fingers. The dog waited. He did not pull or circle or bark. He stood with his weight settled evenly, head slightly lowered, ears alert but relaxed. His fur had gone grey around the muzzle and along his back, the colour spreading gradually over the years without announcement. Peter clipped the lead into place and rested his hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. They stepped off together. The first few steps were always the slowest. The dog paused almost immediately, nose close to the ground, reading the pavement with quiet concentration. Peter stopped with him, shifting his weight without impatience. The pause felt familiar now, part of the walk rather than an interruption. Once, years earlier, Peter would have urged him on. Back then, walks had been brisk and purposeful. Routes were chosen for efficiency rather than interest. The dog had been younger then, lighter on his feet, quicker to move on. Peter had matched that pace easily, barely noticing how often he checked the time or calculated how long they had been out. Now, the rhythm was different. They moved forward in short stretches, punctuated by stops that varied in length. Some were brief, the dog lifting his head after a moment and continuing on. Others lasted longer, his attention caught by something invisible to Peter. A scent left behind hours earlier. A message written in the quiet language of other animals. Peter waited through each one, letting the lead remain loose in his hand. The streetlights cast long shadows ahead of them. Leaves lay scattered along the pavement, pressed flat in places where footsteps had passed. Peter noticed the sound their shoes made, a soft scrape rather than a crunch. The dog's paws moved carefully, no longer bounding, no longer careless. Each step looked considered, not hesitant, simply precise. They reached the corner and turned without needing to decide. This route had once been the shorter option, the one Peter chose on evenings when he wanted to be back home quickly. Over time, it had become the longer way, without him noticing the change. The dog preferred it. Peter had adjusted. The houses here were older, their fronts set closer to the pavement. Small gardens edged with low walls held plants that leaned outward, as if listening. The dog paused at nearly every one, nose brushing the base of a wall, tail lifting slightly as he worked. Peter stood beside him, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding the lead without tension. His thoughts moved slowly. They did not follow a particular path. They rose and fell in response to the pace of the walk, unhurried and incomplete. He noticed how different this felt from the rest of his day, which had been filled with movement that served a purpose. Emails answered, tasks completed, decisions made quickly enough to avoid delay. Here, nothing was being completed. They crossed a side street where no cars passed. The dog hesitated at the curb, then stepped down carefully, adjusting his footing before continuing. Peter matched the movement without thinking, shortening his stride instinctively. He felt the shift in his own body, the way his shoulders lowered slightly when he slowed. He remembered other dogs he had known, not with sadness, but with clarity. Each one had walked differently. Each had taught him something about attention. This dog had taught him patience, though not in the way patience was usually described. It was not endurance or restraint. It was a willingness to remain present without needing progress. They reached the small green at the end of the road. It was barely more than a widening of the pavement with a bench and a tree. But the dog always treated it as an arrival. He stepped onto the grass and stopped completely, lifting his head to take in the air. Peter stopped too, allowing the moment to settle. No wind moved through the branches. The bench sat empty, its surface darkened by earlier rain. The dog made a careful circuit of the grass, his movements slower now, his pauses longer. There was no urgency in him, no sense that something needed to be reached. Peter realized standing there that he no longer felt the need to guide the walk at all. He had not decided this. It had arrived gradually, through repetition rather than choice. Each evening, he had allowed the dog a little more time. Each pause had been accepted without resistance. Somewhere along the way, the walk had stopped being about distance or duration. It had become about accompaniment. The dog finished his circuit and looked up at Peter. Eyes clear, expression neutral. Peter nodded, though nothing had been asked. They turned back the way they had come, retracing their steps at the same unhurried pace. The return journey felt different. There was a sense of completion to it, as though the outward walk had gathered something that now needed to be carried home. Peter felt it in the quiet weight of his body, in the way his breathing had settled without instruction. As they approached their street, Peter noticed how few lights were left on. Most houses had given themselves over tonight. The street belonged to the spaces between now, the gaps where nothing much happened. Peter felt no need to fill that quiet. They reached the front door and stopped. The dog stood patiently while Peter unlocked it, his posture unchanged, his attention present but calm. Once inside, the dog moved toward his bed without prompting and lowered himself carefully, circling once before settling. Peter watched him for a moment, noting the familiar precision of the movement. He closed the door softly and removed his coat. The walk had taken longer than it once would have. No distance had been covered that mattered. No goal had been reached. Peter felt, instead, a steady ease settle into him, the kind that came from having matched another being's pace without loss. He filled the dog's bowl, rinsed the mug he had left by the sink earlier, and switched off the light in the hallway, leaving only the lamp by the sofa glowing softly. The dog remained where he had settled, eyes half closed, his body arranged with the careful economy of something that knew how to rest. Peter sat down and let himself be still. The walk had loosened something in him, not dramatically, but enough to notice. His body felt heavier in a way that was comforting rather than tiring. The thoughts that usually pressed forward at this hour moved more slowly, as if they too had agreed to follow the pace that had been set outside. He remembered when the dog had been younger. Evenings had been louder then. The dog had paced, toy in mouth, ready to go again the moment the door closed. Peter had felt obligated to meet that energy, to keep pace with it, even when his own day had been long. The change had come gradually. There had been no single moment when the dog slowed for the last time. No clear marker that announced a shift. One evening, Peter had noticed an extra pause. Another time, a shorter route. Over weeks and months, the walks had lengthened without covering more ground. At first, Peter had filled the pauses. He had checked his phone. He had counted steps. He had planned the rest of the evening in his head, while the dog read the ground. Those habits had faded as the pauses grew longer. There was only so much distraction that could fit into waiting without purpose. Eventually, he had stopped trying to occupy the time. The waiting had changed shape once it was allowed to be empty. It had become a space rather than an interruption, a moment to stand and breathe, to notice how the street sounded at night, to feel the lead rest loosely in his hand rather than pull. The dog lifted his head briefly and looked toward Peter. Their eyes met for a moment, the look unremarkable and complete. No signal was being sent, no response required. The dog lowered his head again and returned to rest. Peter smiled faintly. There was comfort in that ease, in the absence of demand, companionship that did not require attention to be proven. He had not always known how to recognize that kind of connection. Earlier in life, he'd equated care with action, with doing something useful, with keeping pace. The dog had taught him otherwise. He leaned back against the sofa and let his eyes close briefly. The image of the walk returned to him, not as a sequence of events, but as a feeling. The way the dog's pace had shaped the route, the way stopping had become part of moving rather than its opposite. He felt a quiet gratitude, not framed as thought, but as presence. The dog was here. The night was calm. The day had ended without leaving sharp edges behind. He stood and moved toward the bedroom. At the door, he paused, looked back. "You're all right," Peter said softly, though nothing suggested otherwise. The dog's ear flicked once, acknowledging sound without fully waking. Peter smiled again and continued on. In the bedroom, he moved slowly, changing into sleep without rushing the process. When he finally lay down, the stillness he had carried in from outside remained with him. It did not demand to be preserved. It settled naturally, finding its place without effort. Sleep came easily. It arrived not because the day had been full, but because it had been allowed to end at the right speed. Morning arrived in stages. Light found its way into the room gradually, first as a soft thinning of darkness, then as pale shape along the edges of furniture. Peter woke without alarm, his body already attuned to the day's slower beginning. The dog lifted his head before Peter moved. There was no urgency in him, only awareness. His eyes followed Peter as he sat up, then stretched, joints working carefully through familiar motions. The stretch took longer than it once had. The movements were precise rather than expansive. They moved through the morning together. Peter prepared breakfast while the dog waited near his bowl, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to feel absent. Each movement felt known. Each pause felt allowed. After they ate, Peter opened the back door. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of early grass and distant moisture. The garden lay quiet, its surfaces softened by dew. The dog followed at his own pace, stepping carefully over the threshold and stopping briefly to take in the morning. Peter waited. The dog lifted his head, satisfied. and moved forward. Peter matched him without thought. They walked the same route as the night before. In daylight, the street revealed details that had been invisible in the dark. The texture of brickwork, the faint chalk marks near a doorway, the way plants leaned toward light. The dog paused often, his attention caught by new scents layered over old ones. Peter stood with him, feeling the ground beneath his feet, the morning air against his face. At the small green, the dog stopped again. Peter sat on the bench while the dog made his careful circuit of the grass. A cyclist passed at the far end of the road. A neighbour opened a window, then closed it again. Peter watched without distraction, hands resting loosely on his knees. The dog finished his circuit and came to stand beside Peter. Peter rested his hand briefly on the dog's back, feeling the steady warmth there. The moment did not ask for extension. It completed itself naturally. They stood and turned for home. Back inside, the dog returned to his place near the window and lowered himself carefully. Peter moved through the house with the same unhurried pace, carrying the walk with him rather than leaving it behind. He paused once more before beginning the rest of the day. The dog looked up at him, eyes clear, expression calm. Peter nodded, though nothing had been asked. They had learned something together, not in a way that could be explained or summarized, not in a way that needed to be. They had learned how to move without pushing, how to wait without impatience, how to share time without filling it. The day waited. When they stepped into it, they would do so at a pace that felt agreed upon rather than chosen. Step by step, pause by pause. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.